Well, turns out that he was thinking about the cross-pollination. If you have the neighbor's seed pollinating your seed and your seed pollinating theirs, you have to lift up your neighbor in order to be good yourself. That shows the connections of life that we have, and that shows how we interact with others and how we have to keep every other person in mind. In 1959, at the age of 23, Dad was drafted into the Army. He served 2 years active duty, 2 years in the active reserves, and then 2 more in the inactive reserves. During the initial screening, the doctors found out he had high blood pressure, a trait that I share with him. He and several others were sent to a room to lie down and get some rest so they could retake the blood pressure measurement, see if they could actually get in or not. And after a while, the doctor went back, found a room full of guys doing push-ups. He said, "Well, boys, it's obvious you can't follow directions, so you're in the Army now. If you do have high blood pressure, they'll find out in basic training." So off he went to basic training at Fort Leonard Wood. And then he was stationed after that at Fort Belvoir, and he spent 3 months stationed at West Point, where he taught cadets how to build bridges and driving for General Westmoreland and other lieutenants and captains. In one of his favorite stories, he was waiting in the car to come into the gate at West Point when the limo with the President Eisenhower pulled up, the commander-in-chief. Now, he was not in a uniform, so he's not required to salute, but he was required to get out of his car and at least stand at attention. What he did instead, and these are his words, not mine, is sit there grinning stupidly and waved at the President. Back at Fort Belvoir, just before getting out of active duty, he was within an hour of going to the Bay of Pigs, Cuba. I believe that they were estimating 90% casualties that they had actually done. So I'm certainly grateful for that he did not. He learned a lot of lessons in the Army, some good, some not so good. How to finish lunch in less than 15 seconds, not so good. How to melt a machine gun, probably not so good either. Storing a raccoon in your sergeant's truck, also not a good idea. But one of the good lessons he learned was to follow through on your duties until the job is done. In 1 Corinthians, the Apostle Paul told us to stop thinking like a child and start thinking like a man. My college professor said it slightly different. He wanted us to stop thinking like students and start thinking like engineers. Dad taught us how to be adults more by showing us than telling us what to do. And he showed us to do what is required, not just what is asked. This last weekend, I was able to stand in the spot where Dad stood January 20th, 1961, 54 years ago, as the pastor mentioned. He was in the Honor Corps for the inaugural parade of John F. Kennedy. On the corner of 15th and Pennsylvania, just a stone's throw from the White House, Dad stood for 13 hours. He started at 9 a.m. and did not finish until 10 p.m. The group that was supposed to relieve them never showed up. Don't do what you've been asked, do what is required. Good enough is not good enough, it needs to be your best. Now, that can tend to be turned into perfectionism, and perfectionism is often the bane of engineers, which is why they have the common phrase in the engineering community of shoot the engineer and release the product. You could see some of that in Dad. He would turn thoughts over and over in his head until it was worked out just how he wanted. And in the end, of course, he was convinced that he was correct. Whether or not there was a better idea, chances were pretty good that the idea he had was a good one. I remember asking Dad, or Dad asking me rather, what I wanted to do when I grew up. And of course, being like any normal kid, I said, I want to do just what you're doing, Dad. I wouldn't. But he said, no, I don't want to do what I'm doing. I wore my body out. I lost my knees, not really, but he wore his knees out doing floor covering. He said, you can use something that doesn't wear out. You can use your mind. So my family would probably disagree that I haven't worn that out on occasion. 2 weeks ago, I missed the interstate turnoff to my house. I haven't missed that in 15 years. Another example of doing what is required is serving others. You get better at it the more you do it. And serving others beyond the original request is how he lived his life and how he demands that we live ours. That is translated then into several areas that my siblings will talk about. Helping out on the farm, growing up, serving at the Lions turkey dinners, or planning the next fishing trip.
The theme of what we're talking about today is service. The service my dad did to those around him. My brother spoke of the service he rendered our country through his time in the military. And I'm speaking of the service that he rendered to his family on the farm. His work on the farm, of course, provided us with food, but it also gave us something more important. It taught us kids how to become responsible, yet fun-loving adults. Because my dad worked hard, but as anyone who knew him could testify, he also liked to have fun. A snowy lane must be cleared, but it also means a pile of snow almost as high as the machine shed that you can climb on and play on, and if you're brave enough or crazy enough, climb up to the top of the machine shed and jump off into. He taught us work is a constant. Daily chores with the animals, a yearly cycle of planting and harvest. But there was also a time to set it down, call in the backup, and go on vacation. And we had quite a few memorable vacations, such as the one that Don just took. And the encouragement that my father had given him was, go and make the memories with your family that I made with mine. He taught us not to be afraid to do your own thing by designing his own buildings, with the result that the local vet would invite other farmers over to brag on Dad's behalf. And in that vein, he taught me to do public speaking and how to think on my feet, at least a little bit. We had a father-son banquet at church one time, and we were supposed to bring a pair of our father's shoes to use as a prop to talk about our dads. When I got there, I realized that I had forgotten to bring those shoes. And so in thinking on my feet, when it was my turn, I explained that I could have brought a pair of his shoes, but given the work that we did on the farm, I really doubted that anyone would feel too much like eating if I had done so. Dad laughed along with everyone else. He taught us that work could be an adventure, such as when we watched a funnel cloud overhead while building one of the sheds, which may explain to my wife why to this day I don't have the sense to come inside and go into the basement when the tornado sirens go off. He taught us that work must be done when it must be done. If the tractor breaks, it must be fixed. It doesn't matter if it's a cold, dark, snowy night and you're shaking and shivering so hard that you can barely hold the flashlight still while he's turning the wrench. He taught us that work is a group activity. He did community gardening before community gardening was a thing. Every year he would invite someone from the church or from the community to share our garden. We would plant together, and when it was harvest time, Their family and ours would come together in a time of work, but also always a time of play. But perhaps most importantly, he taught us that work or play was to be a family. If you were out in the cold, he was out there with you. And when you came in, he would be there too, usually working on a puzzle.
Mom asked me to mention a few things with regard to her and Dad that you may not have known. When they were dating, Mom was in nurses training and Dad was in the Army, and they got married shortly after Mom graduated, a couple days. And so Dad's present to her was a sewing machine, and he knew Mom liked to sew, so he wanted to give her that present early enough so that she would have time to sew the dress for the wedding. When cell phones were first invented, he made sure Mom had one so that she felt safe as a nurse traveling to patients' homes and could call him if she needed. And even though he was still working, he would go with Mom sometimes on her middle of the night visits and sit in the car and wait until she was done, even though he had to get up early the next morning and go to work himself. And he was so proud of Mom's work as a nurse, he encouraged her later in life to get an additional certification in the psych field, even driving her to Chicago a couple times for the test. And he was also grateful that she could translate whatever the doctors said into language he could understand, and that she kept track of his health and took care of him in that way. As we mentioned, Dad was very service-minded, and his service did extend beyond family and the military. He served here at this church as head usher for many years because he knew it was important to make people feel really welcome when they came to church, whether they were coming for the very first time or they were long-time members. He knew that was important. He was chairman of the Annex Building Committee and also the Parsonage Remodel when they did that several years ago, and shared his knowledge of building construction with the people that he worked with. He was a really smart man, even though he wasn't formally trained. Only had his high school diploma, but he was really smart. And he paid attention and watched what other people did and learned from them, the good things and from their mistakes, so he didn't repeat them. He had a lot to share with everyone and knew the importance of investing in future generations. But I will say, if you worked with Dad, you did know he was a perfectionist. You know he had always worked everything out in his head beforehand, and that Gibby's way was typically the right way to do it. That could make it a challenge for me to work with him because I share a lot of those characteristics. And I really am pretty sure that I'm the only one who ever butted heads with him, but I knew deep in my heart that his heart was good and he always had the right motive to help the people that came into his life. One of those people more recently was Meth, who owned what was then the Royal Blue, and Dad would often help him by serving when they were short-staffed or by helping count receipts at the end of the night. More recently, he was involved in the American Legion, but when we were kids, he was involved in Lions Club. He felt very strongly about the cause that they represented, and it really did come full circle when I met Michael, whose father was the blind man from Oregon. And it was so clear that there was a face to the people that he had helped all those years. When we were talking about some of the fun memories we had with Dad the other day, I can remember a couple. When I was little, the Lions Club sponsored the annual 4th of July fireworks. And we had the privilege of Dad pulling out the catalogs and saying, "Hey, what shall we order this year?" Not a thing everybody else gets. We would pour through the catalogs and we always asked for the waterfall. That was until the year that the utility poles caught on fire. And we were advised after that, no, we can't have the waterfall anymore. But another time, my brother shared that the insurance man came to the house acting on a tip that someone had said that Dad was storing fireworks in the house or in the garage, and he said, "Oh, I'm not storing fireworks in the garage. Those are the mortars for the fireworks. The fireworks are in the living room." And the insurance man was like, "Oh, tell me that." And so then Dad took them out of the living room and moved them to another room in the house, so you couldn't see them. I will say this. I learned a lot from my dad. He taught me to care for and serve others and have fun doing it. And I know I need to remember the fun part more often. He also taught me to treat problems like a jigsaw puzzle, piece by piece, and with planning and perseverance, to do my best and to take the time to invest in others.
Dad also reserved some time for fun, of course. We took many family vacations over the years. But even then, Dad was still teaching us life lessons. One of the most memorable trips that we took was to Minnesota to do a little bit of bluegill fishing. One evening, while at the boat dock, Dad struck up a conversation with a grandfather and a grandson. And it turned out that the grandson's father had recently passed away, and the grandfather was going to take his grandson fishing as a way to help him cope with the loss. The problem was that neither the grandson nor the grandfather knew much about fishing, and they were not having the luck that we were having. So my dad proposed an exchange program. The next morning, although I think Don and I were a little reluctant at first, we met at the boat dock, and Don and I hopped in the grandfather's boat, and Dad took the grandson, and for the next 2 days we fished with those boats side by side until we had taught them everything we knew about bluegill fishing. In the end, I think everybody learned a little something new. I sometimes wonder what the impact of that small gesture of kindness had on that grandfather and the grandson. I'm sure the young boy felt the world was cruel and unfair for having taken his father at a premature age. But I'm also sure that my dad's kindness brought a little happiness into the life of this boy when he needed it the most. And that's what I learned from Dad, to be kind to others, and especially children. I want to close by revisiting the story that my brother had opened with about the farmer, because while there's some similarities, I think there's one important difference between that farmer and my dad. In that story, of course, the motivation for sharing the seed corn was ultimately self-serving, right, to preserve the genetics of the farmer's crop. My dad befriended strangers and helped those in need and expected nothing in return. He did this because he was a good and decent man, and that's what good and decent men do.